Hello and welcome to video 6 of this Genesis Bible study. Today we'll be going through Abraham and the binding of Isaac, Genesis chapters 20 through chapter 25 verse 18. My name is John Davis and I am the evangelization and discipleship coordinator at St. Matthew Catholic Church in Winter Haven, Florida. If you'd like to contact me, you can email me at evangelization@stmcc.com. This Bible study is based off of A Catholic Introduction to the Bible, the Old Testament, by John Bergsma and Brant Petrie. It can be purchased in both Kindle and hardcover at Amazon.com. The study guide for this 10-part video series can be purchased at Amazon.com. Just do a search for Genesis, a Catholic Bible Study by John P. Davis. And you'll be able to find it that way. It's a paperback book. Genesis chapter 20 verse 1 says, Abraham journeyed towards the region of the Negeb and settled between Kadesh and Shur while residing in Gerar as an alien. Gerar was a Canaanite city in the western part of Negeb, and Negeb was where Abraham was for a short time after he was told to leave Egypt. Genesis chapter 20 verse 2 says, Abraham said of his wife Sarah, she is my sister, and King Abimelech of Gerar sent and took Sarah. Abraham again is afraid for his life, and so he says Sarah is his sister again, just like we saw in Genesis chapter 12. So he's not trusting in God completely here. Once again, he hasn't been granted all the promises that God said he would get, so he should have realized that his life really wouldn't have been in danger here. Abimelech is a personal name that is relatively common in Northwest Semitic literature, and the name comes up again, we'll see, with Isaac. He has a run-in as well with Abimelech, and it could be this king Abimelech's son. But if you translate the name Abimelech, it does mean my father is king, so it could just be used more as a title than an actual name. Now, Abimelech may have taken Sarah in marriage to form an alliance with Abraham, sort of like you see throughout history, where kings of one country will marry the daughter of a king of another country to form some alliance and have a treaty so they don't go to war with each other. That could have been happening here, as Abraham would have acquired quite a bit of wealth by this time, as we saw with what happened when he was in Egypt. And then also, he did defeat a bunch of kings in this region in chapter 14. So he had a reputation of being strong. So King Abimelech, once Abraham moved into the area, could have been like, okay, I need to form an alliance. And it's also an indication that by this stage of the game, Abraham has already formed a great nation as God promised, because King Abimelech wouldn't be making a treaty with just a guy in himself. So there would have to have been a great nation involved with this as well. Genesis chapter 20 verse 3 says, But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, You are about to die because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a married woman. God often utilizes dreams to communicate with people in the Bible. We see it in multiple occasions throughout the Bible. But here, the prince's behavior that we'll see going forward indicates that this prince, even though he probably had multiple deities, did have some belief and knowledge of the one true God because of how he reacts after this dream. Now, God would have came to Abimelech in a dream, basically to warn him that he didn't approve of this situation. And it does show once again God's disapproval of polygamy. But here he comes to him because he's warning him so that it puts no doubt into the legitimacy of Isaac. Isaac hasn't been born yet, but that's about to happen soon. Genesis chapter 20 verse 4 says, Now Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, Lord, will you destroy an innocent people? Unlike the last story with the Pharaoh, here it's plainly stated that Abimelech didn't have any sexual relations with Sarah. Now, the Hebrew term used for Lord here is Adonai, and that was just a customary address to any divine being. So here it's just kind of showing that Abimelech probably had multiple gods that he was praying to, as he didn't call the one true God Yahweh, which would be expected if that was the only God he was involved with. Genesis chapter 20 verse 5 says, Did he not himself say to me, She is my sister? And she herself said, He is my brother. I did this in the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands. Abimelech's pleading his innocence and blaming Sarah and Abraham, and he's actually right here. If he didn't know, how can he be put to blame for this? Now, you could say that maybe he didn't pick up on the signs that he could have, but in any sense, it does seem like it's more Abraham and Sarah who are at fault for this. And integrity means blameless or upright in this verse. And it's the same thing that God used or commanded Abraham in chapter 17, verse 1, where he commanded Abraham to walk before him and be blameless. In that case, though, Abraham was guilty of something. But here, the foreign king Abimelech is the one who's blameless rather than Abraham. Genesis chapter 20 verse 7 says, Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die, you and all that are yours. This is the first time we see the term prophet in the Bible. And a prophet is someone who represents God and is a spokesperson for God. And they usually urge people to remain loyal or to obey his commands to avoid judgment. We see that with Isaiah, Jeremiah, and others. And normally these prophets come about because the Hebrew people aren't following God's commands anymore. And here, Abraham is God's chosen representative, so God will accept Abraham's intercession. And how Abraham will intercede for Abimelech is once Abimelech returns Sarah to him, he will pray and ask God to bless Abimelech. Genesis chapter 20 verse 9 says, Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, What have you done to us? How have I sinned against you, that you have brought such great guilt on me and my kingdom? You have done things to me that ought not to be done. Abraham's distrust of God is what ultimately caused this event. And in a way, Abraham and Sarah's selfish act, which was thinking about themselves, has caused this temptation and then the afflictions on this other group of people. And if you think about it, that happens a lot, where somebody sins or does an action that maybe they think is beneficial for them, and either they don't care or can't see how that action negatively affects others. Genesis chapter 20 verse 11 and 12 says, Abraham said, I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. An interesting difference between the interaction with the Pharaoh and the king is that here Abraham is able to speak freely his mind, which shows that Abraham and Abimelech were on much more equal footing than Abraham and the Pharaoh from Egypt were. And in a way, you can't blame Abraham for thinking there was no fear of God in this place after what had happened in Sodom and Gomorrah and how they were acting. They were obviously going against what God wanted. So maybe he saw here some of the similar things going on when he got here. But once again, Abraham's decision to say that Sarah was his sister is really motivated by his fear of being harmed, and he should have known that God was protecting him. Genesis chapter 20 verses 14 and 15 says, Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham and restored his wife Sarah to him. Abimelech said, My land is before you, settle where it pleases you. Despite Abraham's deception, he once again is profiting greatly from it, just like he did in Egypt. Now, the biggest difference between that story and how that ended and how this story ends is here, Abimelech is actually giving land to Abraham, which is a subtle hint and clue that Abraham is starting to acquire this land that he was promised in Canaan from God. Genesis chapter 20 verses 17 and 18 say, Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, and also healed his wife and female slaves, so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed fast all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. Abraham prays to God, and God accepts Abraham's intercession, heals Abimelech. We don't know what Abimelech was suffering from, maybe something similar to what afflicted Job. But they would have had to have been there, Abraham and Sarah, long enough so that the people around would have known, okay, nobody's getting pregnant, what's up with that? So they would have had to be here for a little bit of time. And then God probably closed everyone's womb, including Sarah, so that there wouldn't be any doubt about who the father of Isaac was going to be. Because you have to remember that we're coming quick on the time where Sarah will have a son, and it would have to be no doubt that the father was Abraham. Genesis chapter 21 verse 2 says, Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. God fulfills his promise to Abraham and Sarah. Sarah conceives through Abraham, and the phrase conceived and bore, that comes up again in the story of Hannah and how she had her son Samuel, which was also through divine destiny. Genesis chapter 21 verse 4 says, And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, and God had commanded him. Abraham's observing the sign of the covenant, which was circumcision for that second covenant of a great name. And that's been the tradition ever since for Jewish people to have their sons circumcised on the 8th day. That's when Jesus would have been circumcised as well. Genesis chapter 21 verse 6 says, Now Sarah said, God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. We're just seeing again another wordplay on Isaac's name, which means he laughed. Genesis chapter 21 verse 8 says, The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. The age that a child was weaned varied in the ancient Near Eastern cultures, but once they were weaned, the father would always throw a big party. So we're seeing here more historical evidence that this really took place. Now, St. Jerome, who wrote the Latin Vulgate, says that Isaac was 5 years old. There's other people who say he was maybe all the way up to 12 years old. So nobody knows for sure. Genesis chapter 21 verse 9 says, "But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac." Whatever this playing was obviously corrupting Isaac's morals. And mitzachek, that's the Hebrew word that's used here, and that can refer to like idolatry or just obscene actions or fighting. But mitzachek can also mean some sort of sexual transgression. And we'll see that with the next king Abimelech when he's dealing with Isaac, in that when he looks out the window and sees Isaac, the word is he sees Isaac mitzaching his wife. And so at that moment, he then knows that Rebekah is actually Isaac's wife and not just his sister, because whatever he was doing, you wouldn't do that with your sister. And then we also see later on, we'll see in Genesis chapter 30, that Joseph, when he is a servant after being captured, that the wife, that she tries to get Joseph to do things sexually with her, and he refuses. So then she just lies and says that he was tzaching with me. So she accuses him of sexual indiscretion with her, which he didn't do, but they use the same root word there as well. Genesis chapter 21 verse 10 says, "So she said to Abraham, Cast out the slave woman with her son. For the son of the slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." Whatever the act was that Ishmael was doing with Isaac, it was severe enough that Sarah had enough and said they both have to go. St. Jerome sees this verse as an allegory, with Ishmael being the figure of the synagogue, which persecuted the early church, and we see that with the stoning of St. Stephen. And St. Paul in Galatians chapter 4 uses this story as an allegory to represent the two covenants that God made with his people. Ishmael symbolizes the covenant of the old law given to Moses on Mount Sinai, which established the Jews as God's chosen people, but also in a way they were his servants who had to be obedient out of fear of punishment by all those 600 laws that they ended up having one day. Whereas Isaac, on the other hand, denotes the new covenant that Jesus instituted, where Jesus suffered and established a new law, and through these laws, those who have faith in Christ and get baptized are considered as Abraham's spiritual descendants, and they'll inherit the blessings that God promised to Abraham. Genesis chapter 21 verse 11 says, "The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son." This would obviously be very stressful for Abraham. He would have loved Ishmael and probably would have cared for Hagar as well. But I think he realized it was wise to let both go together, maybe so Hagar could protect Ishmael. Although one must remember that at this point, Ishmael would have at least been 16, 17, 18 years old, somewhere in there. So maybe she was leaving because she could have been encouraging Ishmael to behave this way towards Isaac, or she neglected to punish or watch over Ishmael, and so she deserved to share in this banishment as well. Genesis chapter 21 verse 12 says, "God said to Abraham, Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you." God knows sending Ishmael away is better, because it's going to prevent him from corrupting Isaac or claiming what belongs to Isaac. Remember, once someone is banished, they're eliminated from the family, so Ishmael will no longer have any claim on anything of Abraham's. And you see this throughout the Hebrew history, that they really frown on any sort of intermixing, and any time that happens, that bad things come from it. So this first example is just a prefiguration of the other times that it would happen. And I also think this is a great indication of how God works, in that he uses secondary causes and doesn't directly make things happen himself. So Sarah might not even have realized that her getting upset at what Ishmael did and saying they should be banished was exactly what God wanted. But she might not have seen the reasons why God wanted that to happen. Genesis chapter 21 verse 13 says, "As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So God is going to fulfill that first promise that he set with Abraham off onto Ishmael as well. So Abraham's sons will both have great nations. Ishmael will have one, and Isaac will have many great nations. Genesis chapter 21 verse 14 says, "Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away." It's somewhat shocking in a way, knowing how rich Abraham was, that he really only gives them bread and water. It seems like he should have given them more than that, but perhaps he was only giving them a little bit because he wasn't intending for them to go too far away, and then he would still look after them because it wouldn't be too far away. Of course, we know Hagar ends up getting lost, but maybe the intent was for them not to go too far away, and that's why he only gave them some bread and a little bit of water. Genesis chapter 21 verse 16 says, "Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, 'Do not let me look on the death of the child.' And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept." Couple interesting things here. That one, a bow shot, we're going to see that in a few minutes, that Ishmael's descendants are actually really good with a bow. So that's like a little reference to that, I think. But here we're seeing, even though it's more implied, it doesn't come outright and say it, that she's praying to God as she kind of is lifting up her voice. And I wouldn't be shocked if she was saying, "God, you said that my son would have a great nation, and we're about to die right here. I don't see a great nation." Genesis chapter 21 verse 17 says, "And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, 'What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is.'" God who hears and the angel of God, the person speaking, they're not one and the same here. And we see this a lot throughout Scripture, where angels speak on God's behalf. And they even use language like they are God themselves, but they're just talking on God's behalf. And it's interesting, we'll see this a little bit later, but both of Abraham's sons are saved by an angel calling from heaven. Genesis chapter 21 verses 18 and 19 say, "Come, lift up the boy, and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God opens her eyes, guides her to a fountain. It was probably hidden just in some brushwood near where her son was, and he gets revived. I wouldn't be shocked, though, if anything, she was just so stressed out and anxious that she just had tunnel vision. A lot of times that happens when someone gets stressed. So the water could have just been there, and as soon as God spoke to her and told her that her son would have a great nation, that relieved her stress. So she was able just to see better because she was no longer stressed out. Genesis chapter 21, verses 20 and 21 says, God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Throughout his journey to manhood, God blesses Ishmael. And the descendants of Ishmael were expert marksmen. We see in Isaiah chapter 21, verse 17, it mentions the warriors of Kedar. And Kedar is a son of Ishmael. Now, since in a way Ishmael's been banished and is no longer part of Abraham's family, it falls on his mother to get him a wife. We're going to see this later on with Isaac, that in those days it was the parents who picked a wife or a husband for their child. Genesis chapter 21 verse 22 says, At this time Abimelech with Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. The king of Gerar recognizes that Abraham was a prophet and a favored one of God, mainly for what happened last time they dealt with him, in that once Abraham prayed for him, things got a lot better. Now, Gerar was a town in the Philistine plains, and it's southeast of Gaza, and that's mentioned in Genesis chapter 10, verse 19. Genesis chapter 21, verses 23 and 24 say, Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me or with my offspring or with my posterity. But as I have dealt loyally with you, you will deal with me and with the land where you have resided as an alien. And Abraham said, I swear it. So the native prince, Abimelech, wants to form a treaty with Abraham. And this really shows that that first promise of a great nation has come true. It was a little bit more implied earlier that that probably already was the case, but now it's more explicit, because you wouldn't form an alliance with, once again, with just a person. And the way the ancient Near East people frequently formalized treaties was through taking of oaths. So they're making an oath here just to be loyal friends and non-aggressive towards each other. Genesis chapter 21 verses 25 and 26 say, When Abraham complained to Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today. Wells were of great importance in that time, as they still are today. You have to have water to live. And if you made a new well, the owner was supposed to be informed in person that you were making a new well. So if you were going to make a well on somebody's land, you had to inform the owner. Now, possession of wells in any unoccupied lands meant that whoever built that well would own the land. Or if the well was in need of repair, whoever restored it obtained its rights. So in this instance, Abimelech's servants must have done one of those three things. They either didn't inform Abraham that they were going to build a well on his land, or they just took possession of a well, thinking it was unoccupied land, or they repaired one and took possession of it that way. Genesis chapter 21, verse 27 says, So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. In the ancient Near East, they would use verbal or ritual oaths to solemnize these covenants. And there were really three different types of covenants that scholars have put to that time period. this covenant here would have been a parity or kinship covenant because it's emphasizing mutual and familial relationship. But there were two other kinds of covenants. A covenant where only the inferior party swears to the superior one is called a vassal covenant. And this was typically imposed by the superior party to regulate the inferior's conduct. So they had the upper hand and they wanted the inferior party to act and behave a certain way. Now, a grant covenant occurred when only the superior party swears to the inferior party, and a lot of times this was done as a reward for the inferior party being loyal to the superior party. Genesis chapter 21 verses 30 and 31 says, he said, "These 7 ewe lambs you shall accept from my hand, in order that you may be a witness for me that I dug this well." Therefore that place was called Beersheba, because there both of them swore an oath. Here Abraham's just saying, I'll give you these 7 ewe lambs since you are my witness that I built this well. And if you have the witness of a king, I mean, that's going to stand over anyone else. So it would be obvious that Abraham owned that well. Genesis chapter 21 verse 33 says, "Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God." Once again, we see Abraham continuing that practice of making an altar to thank God for all his favors. Now, it's unlikely that temples were known in any part of the world at this time. So to demonstrate his respect for God, Abraham planted a grove of trees, and that's very similar to the temple that was the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, it was composed of trees, and as we talked about earlier, that was considered a temple. So the planting of trees would have been the temple. Genesis chapter 22 verse 1 says, "After these things God tested Abraham. He said to him, 'Abraham,' and he said, 'Here I am.'" It's obvious from the way the author covers this story that God never intended for Isaac to be put to death. And the whole point of this story is just to test the faith of Abraham. We've seen in the past that his faith has wavered from time to time, and this will be that ultimate test of faith. And this sacrifice of Isaac is depicted as a kind of microcosm of Abraham's complete journey of faith. And we see that because similar language is used. In the beginning, when Abraham was first called by God, God said, "Go to a land I will show you." And here, God says, "Go to a mountain I will tell you." So it's using very, very similar language here. And we'll see throughout this story that Abraham does have unwavering obedience in this instance here. And it's like the start of his journey all over again. And another good parallel between the Genesis 12 and Genesis 22 is that in Genesis 12, Abraham is separated from the family of his past. And here, if the sacrifice would have gone all the way to the end, he would be separated from his future family or his descendants through Isaac. Genesis chapter 22 verse 2 says, "He said, 'Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you.'" So God comes right out and says, okay, you're gonna sacrifice your beloved son, your only beloved son. And that phrase is used 3 times in Genesis 22, the Hebrew word of yadid. And yadid means unique or singular, and then it's translated to beloved in the Septuagint. And this really mirrors what we'll see with God the Father and God the Son in the New Testament, as Jesus is the only begotten Son of God the Father, and then the beloved Son in whom God is well pleased. So we see those words being used for Jesus later on. Moriah is where King Solomon's temple in Jerusalem will be constructed, and we see that in 2 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 1. It says Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. Genesis chapter 22 verse 3 says, So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. The word used for describing Isaac here, the Hebrew word is the same word that's used to describe the 2 young men. So it's commonly believed that Isaac was a child, but in reality he was a young man and an adult already at this time. Genesis chapter 22 verse 6 says, Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. This is just more evidence that Isaac was not a little child. The wood that would have been needed for a burnt offering of a lamb or a ram would have been a pretty big amount. It would have been very heavy, something a child couldn't have carried. So that's just more evidence that Isaac was a young man. And based off these narrative clues, the ancient Jewish interpreters concluded that Isaac wasn't a child, but was in fact a young man who would have been much stronger than his elderly father. Genesis chapter 22 verses 7 and 8 says, And Isaac said to his father Abraham, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. He said, Behold, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So the 2 of them walked on together. Here it seems like Isaac's starting to figure this whole thing out. So it would have been very easy for him at this stage just to be like, all right, I'm out of here. See you later. So he's obviously a willing participant in what's about to happen. And that really justifies the use of the term sacrifice, even though he survives, because he was more than willing to be sacrificed. Genesis chapter 22 verse 9 says, When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. So yes, Abraham is showing strong faith here. He's about to sacrifice his son. But let's think a little bit about Isaac. I think Isaac is often overlooked in this discussion. Isaac would have willingly let his father bind his hands. There's no other way that could have been done. He would be much stronger than Abraham, so if he didn't want to get his hands bound, he would have just not got him bound. And then most likely he crawled up onto this wood. So think of the strong faith that Isaac had here. And it's even stronger in some ways than Abraham, because Abraham at least has talked to God before. At this stage of the game, it's never said that Isaac has spoken to God himself. So he's just basing his faith off of his parents' faith. And as any of you who have children know, that doesn't always work, especially as those children get older. So I think Isaac here, in a lot of ways, is the stronger in faith than even Abraham. Now, Isaac is one of the strongest prefigurations of Jesus and the passion of Christ. And we see a lot of similarities between Isaac's sacrifice and Jesus's. Some of the church fathers, and I actually like this viewpoint, would say that Isaac was the same age as Jesus, which would have been around 33 years old. And 33 is probably the prime age for a man. So just like with the sacrifice of lambs, they always wanted the prime top lambs. Well, Jesus would have been at the prime of his life, as would Isaac. Now, the father Abraham is offering his only begotten son as a sacrifice. And God the Father offers his only begotten Son as a sacrifice. And then this one's really beautiful in my eyes. It's Isaac carries the wood of his sacrifice up the mountain, just as Jesus, the Son, will carry the wood of his sacrifice up Golgotha. And then Isaac says, "My Father," before his sacrifice, and Jesus prays Father before his sacrifice. Then Abraham declares that God will provide himself the lamb. And then Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. We hear John the Baptist say that. And Isaac is willingly offering himself in sacrifice in obedience to his father. And Jesus willingly offers himself in sacrifice in obedience to his father. This one's also beautiful in my eyes, and I think it's sometimes overlooked. But God provides a ram caught by his horns in a thicket, and a thicket would have been full of thorns. So you can imagine the ram and his head sticking out, and there would have been thorns on his head, just like God provides his Son wearing a crown of thorns on his head. And then the sacrifice of Isaac takes place on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, and then Jesus is sacrificed on Calvary on his mountain, which is also in Jerusalem. Genesis chapter 22 verses 10 and 11 says, "Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, 'Abraham, Abraham.' And he said, 'Here I am.'" The angel of the Lord calls out Abraham's name twice, probably to make sure that he actually hears him and doesn't go through with this sacrifice, because they probably waited till the very last second to stop it, just to make sure that Abraham was going to go through it. And then "Here I am" is a good bookend to this story, in that at the start of this narrative, when God first called Abraham, he said, "Here I am." And then at the end, to end this story, he says again, "Here I am." Genesis chapter 22 verse 12 says, "He said," and this is the angel of the Lord, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." The intention to sacrifice Isaac was done with complete sincerity, and that's obvious to God now. So God is accepting with the utmost approval of what has been done by Abraham, and so Abraham has passed this ultimate test of his faith. And I would say Isaac as well has passed that ultimate test of his faith. Genesis chapter 22 verse 13 says, "And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son." Another sacrifice is provided, and if you think back a few verses, Abraham actually did say God will provide. I don't think he realized he was going to provide a ram, but that did end up coming true. So just as the ram was sacrificed in place of Isaac, Christ was offered as a sacrifice for all of us. Genesis chapter 22 verse 15 says, "The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven." Again, God is talking through an angel and not directly himself to Abraham. Genesis chapter 22 verses 16 through 18 say, "By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will indeed bless you, and I will make your offerings as numerous as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies, and by your offspring shall all the nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice." God is elevating that final promise of a universal blessing to the level of a covenant due to Abraham passing this test of faith. There isn't the word covenant used in this passage, but it's pretty hard to ignore that it is a covenant. And we saw that covenants were established by means of an oath, as shown in the covenant between King Abimelech and Abraham. And this covenant solemnization, though just done by an oath, is on par with the accounts of Genesis 15 and 17. If we look at the sacrifices revolving around these three covenants and the solemnization of these three covenants, we see for the first promise and covenant of a great nation, there was a shedding of animal blood. And then the second covenant of a great name was a shedding of Abraham's own flesh through circumcision. Then this third covenant, the promise of a universal blessing, came through the shedding of his son's blood, Isaac. And with each new covenant, we see that they become more difficult and more intimate. Now, the main difference between the promise of this universal blessing and how the covenant plays out with it is that now, instead of just Abraham getting a universal blessing, it's passing down to his seed. And by seed, they mean descendants. And if we look back at what we said about Galatians chapter 4, where St. Paul was talking about this, anyone who becomes a Christian is considered a descendant of Abraham through that new covenant. So technically, we all benefit from this universal blessing that Abraham received from God. Genesis chapter 23 verses 1 and 2 says, Sarah lived 127 years. This was the length of Sarah's life, and Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Sarah is the only woman in Scripture whose age, death, and burial are mentioned. It's most likely due out of respect for the matriarch of the whole Hebrew nation. Genesis chapter 24 verse 2 says, Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his house, who had charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh. Oldest probably meant that he was of the most seniority and was the most trustworthy. So this errand that Abraham was going to send him on, he would have been the best one to handle this. Then putting your hand under a thigh in ancient Near Eastern tradition was what you did before you swore an oath. And it was thought to mean that if you didn't go through on this oath, that you would become sterile. Genesis chapter 24 verse 3 says, And I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and earth, that you will not get away from my son from the daughters of the Canaanites. Among the ancient Near Eastern tribes, the matrimonial arrangements, as I already said, were made by the parents. And generally, they would pick from amongst their own tribe, and usually it was a first cousin. Now, Abraham's afraid for his son to marry a Canaanite woman because he's had experience with Canaanite people and know that they would probably lead him astray from the one true God. And we do see that happen many times throughout the Old Testament. Genesis chapter 24 verse 4 says, Go to my country and to my kindred and get a wife for my son Isaac. We see that Abraham is asking his servant to go to his family and get a wife for his son. And Nahor, we heard about him early in Genesis chapter 12, and that's who Abraham was living with before he was told to leave his family. Genesis chapter 24 verses 5 and 6 say, The servant said to him, Perhaps a woman may not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? Abraham said to him, See to it that you do not take my son back there. Abraham does not want his son basically to leave the promised land. Genesis chapter 24 verse 7 says, The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my birth, and who spoke to me and swore to me, To your offspring I will give this land. He will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. Abraham's theology is actually allowing for women to say no to this offer. So it's not like just pick a woman and bring her against her will. And of course, that probably wouldn't work out very well anyway, and I think he realizes that. Now here, his angel before you could be signifying the servant's guardian angel. Genesis chapter 24 verse 10 says, Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels and departed, taking all kinds of choice gifts from his master. And he set out and went to Aram Naharaim, to the city of Nahor. 10 camels were needed because they would have been bringing along a lot of gifts or marriage presents. Now, Aram Naharaim is sometimes translated as Mesopotamia because it's understood as Aram of the rivers or Aram of the land between the two rivers, which is where Mesopotamia is. Genesis chapter 24 verse 12 says, And he said, O Lord, God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love for my master Abraham. So the servant of Abraham, who most likely prayed to multiple gods, because if he was an old servant, probably was given to Abraham when they were in Egypt, is the first individual mentioned in the Bible to pray for divine guidance. And that's kind of interesting and maybe even a foreshadowing of when Gentiles will be doing that in the new covenant. Genesis chapter 24 verse 14, and this is a servant talking, says, Let the girl to whom I shall say, Please offer your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, Drink, and I will water your camels. Let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master. The servant selecting a sign that would show this woman's kindness and modesty, which in his eyes would be a suitable partner for the devout Isaac. Genesis chapter 24 verse 15 says, Before he had finished speaking, there was Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, coming out with her water jar on her shoulder. Before this servant even finishes his prayer, God's already answering it. And I think that's a good symbolic meaning of like anyone, regardless of their previous background, if they reach out to the one true God, he will be there for them. Genesis chapter 24 verse 17 says, The servant ran to meet her and said, Please let me sip a little water from your jar. The servant's so excited by God answering the prayer that he runs up to Rebekah. Genesis chapter 24 verses 19 and 20 say, When she had finished giving him a drink, she said, I will draw from your camels also, till they have finished drinking. So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran again to the well to draw, and she drew for all his camels. Rebekah's going above and beyond what even the servant asked for. So if we think about that in our prayer life, if we ask God something, he can and often will go above and beyond what we ask for, especially if we ask in a humble fashion like this servant did. Genesis chapter 24 verse 21 says, The man gazed at her in silence to learn whether or not the Lord had made his journey successful. The servant's not staring for any other reason than to figure out if Rebekah is actually from Abraham's family. I also think this is kind of pointing out that we shouldn't make presumptions that God is or has answered our prayers. And I think that's what the servant's doing here. He's just making sure that, yes, my prayer was answered. Genesis chapter 24 verse 22 says, When the camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold nose ring weighing half a shekel, and 2 bracelets for her arm weighing 10 gold shekels. So here the servant is giving gifts already to Rebekah, in a way to reveal Abraham's wealth, maybe to help convince her and her family to allow her to return with him, because she would be well taken care of. Genesis chapter 24 verses 26 and 27 says, The man bowed his head and worshipped the Lord and said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness towards my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on the way to the house of my master's kin. So however Rebekah responded is revealing that she is related to Abraham, so the servant's prayers were answered. Genesis chapter 24 verse 33 says, Then food was set before him to eat, but he said, I will not eat until I have told my Aaron. Rebekah takes him back to her house, and then before he eats, he wants to tell them this story. So he understands that really his journey isn't complete yet because she's not going back with him. So before he even takes care of himself, he wants to take care of his master. And that's showing good piety, fidelity, and really a disinterestedness in himself in a very beautiful way. Genesis chapter 24 verse 49 says, Now then, if you will deal loyally and truly with my master, tell me, and if not, tell me so that I may either turn to the right hand or to the left. So you skipped ahead and he retold that whole story of his journey and why he was here. And now he just wants to know, okay, are you going to let me take her or do I have to search elsewhere? Genesis chapter 24 verse 50 says, Then Laban and Bethulah answered, The thing comes from the Lord. We cannot speak to you anything bad or good. Bethulah is Rebekah's father, but he's listed second. And we know from other instances in Genesis that they always listed the most important person first. So Laban is the one in charge or the head of this household. So he's going to be the one who decides if Rebekah goes with them or not. Now that could be mainly because Bethulah could have been really old, and so Laban is just taking the reins from his father. Genesis chapter 24 verse 51 says, Look, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken. Laban believes this servant's account of what happened, and he consents to letting Rebekah go. Now, this is just a consent at this stage of the game for her to go with him. It's not a consent to marriage. That will be worked out a little bit later. And so this just revolves around Rebekah's willingness to leave right now. Genesis chapter 24 verse 53 says, And the servant brought out jewelry of silver and of gold, and garments, and gave them to Rebekah. He also gave to her brother and to her mother costly ornaments. It's unclear whether these gifts are part of a dowry or just meant to show generosity. These were things that were given along with money as a dowry, and that is very historical, as that was done in ancient Near Eastern times, and in some countries it's even still done today. Genesis chapter 24 verse 59 says, So they sent away their sister Rebekah and her nurse, along with Abraham's servant and his men. So Rebekah is about to go and meet her future husband. Genesis chapter 24 verses 63 and 64 say, Isaac went out in the evening to walk in the field, and looking up he saw camels coming. And Rebekah looked up, and when she saw Isaac, she slipped quickly from the camel. This was also another ancient Near Eastern custom of the lower status person getting to a lower level like the higher status person. So it would have been disrespectful for Rebekah to stay on the camel while Isaac was walking. How would she have known that he was of higher status? Most likely from the way he was dressed. Genesis chapter 24 verse 65 says, and this is Rebekah talking, Who is the man over there walking in the field to meet us? The servant said, It is my master. So she took her veil and covered herself. Once again, another ancient Near Eastern tradition. Most likely while they were traveling and there weren't very many people, she would have kept off her veil. But as soon as she would come around a stranger, she would pull her veil over to cover her face to hide everything but her eyes. And for a bride, it also symbolized her respect and then submission to her spouse. Genesis chapter 24, verse 67 says, Then Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent. He took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So Isaac married Rebekah, and then they fell in love. Very common occurrence, obviously, at the time when you'd have an arranged marriage, that it would take time before you would quote unquote love someone. So it's not unusual to see that listed here in that way. Genesis chapter 25 verse 1 and 2 says, Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. This marriage took place before Sarah's death. It says that Abraham took another wife. Now, the reason this is mentioned out of sequence is just to properly conclude his story. And this is a very common occurrence throughout historical texts, ancient historical texts. We see that in the New Testament as well, like we talked about before, where they put all of Jesus' miracles into one chapter. Most likely they happened over a larger period of time, but they were clumping them together. So it isn't uncommon for narrative stories to be a little out of sequence. And we even see that in movies, or movies will sometimes start in the future and then go back into the past. So it's not uncommon even today in storytelling. Genesis chapter 25 verses 5 and 6 say, Abraham gave all he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines Abraham gave gifts while he was still living, and he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. Concubines here would have included Hagar, but with his second concubine, he also sent her away, most likely just so those children wouldn't corrupt Isaac. So this is even more evidence that he married her before Sarah died, because I don't think if Isaac was like 30 years old or 40, he had been corrupted by a bunch of little kids. And here's another example of sometimes the Bible uses words. Like here it says Abraham gave all he had to Isaac, but then in the very next sentence, it says that he gave gifts to his concubines. So obviously, he didn't give everything he had to Isaac, and that's a common occurrence throughout the Bible and other literary books of the time and even today. And he didn't have to give them anything once he sent them away. So it's showing the generosity that Abraham had, even though he wasn't obliged anymore to give them anything. Genesis chapter 25 verses 7 and 8 says, This is the length of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. This shows some historical elements to it, as well as 175 years is much closer in line with the amount of time people live today. Whereas Noah living to 950 and Adam living 930 years, that could be considered honorific and more metaphorical talk. But this seems much more in line with what would be expected. And then gathered to his people implies that Abraham died and was reunited with loved ones or ancestors in the afterlife. Genesis chapter 25 verses 9 and 10 say, His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, son of Zorah the Hittite, east of Mamre, in the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah. We see that Isaac and Ishmael are the only two sons mentioned, but they did come together, and this just shows that Ishmael couldn't have been too far away or wasn't completely cut off from the family, because he knew that his father had died. And it's generous of Isaac in a way, because I think he could have just kept Ishmael away, but he didn't, and he let him mourn for his father. Genesis chapter 25, verse 12 says, "These are the descendants of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's slave girl, bore to Abraham." The sacred author briefly mentions Ishmael before he's going to move on to Isaac, but he does this just to show that the promise that God made to Ishmael is actually fulfilled through his descendants. That concludes the story of Abraham. Next time we will be covering Genesis chapters 25 verse 19 through chapter 31. Hopefully you'll tune in next time, and thank you.